Well, happy, beautiful, amazing day. Dr. Bob Rakowski here out of Houston, Texas, with my new friend, 45-year clinical psychologist, founder of the True Bearing Academy, Dr. Nathan Brown. Nathan, you've got a heck of a resume. You've been enhancing brains for 45 years. And by the way, you also figured out somewhere along the way that it's not just people whose brains aren't working as well as we want them to, but people who have good brains who want the best out of their brains. And I'm excited to share. So, where do you want to start? Tell me your backstory.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you, Dr. Bob, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I've enjoyed, seeing some of your podcasts ahead of time, and I kind of know you're interested in the same things that I am. Well, let me tell you a little bit about me. As you said, I've been, in clinical psychology for a long time. I have to be a little humble about the resume. I've found out if you live long enough, you end up with a pretty good resume over time. But I got interested in neurotherapy. We can talk in a moment about what that is. Way at the beginning of my training, I was in graduate school, fortunate enough to be in grad school in the 70s and 80s in Southern California. Right there, full stop. Southern California in the 70s and 80s was a great time to be there. But it was also the time in which neurofeedback had been discovered and was being refined. And I was fortunate that my mentor was actually, he was in his 80s, at the time he kinda came out of retirement to, be dean at my school, and he was the first man to measure brainwaves in North America. So I was really fortunate to be with the old guard, in neurofeedback and then, be around as a grad student, be around some of the people who were really founding fathers and mothers, in this field way back then.
Do you recall the year? What year did he measure brainwaves?
So Hans Berger measured brainwaves in, I think, 1926. Hans Berger in Germany, might have that off by a year or two. Lee Travis, my mentor, did that his measurement in 1929,
Wow.
and actually was corresponding with Berger in Germany. And so, yeah, he also in his spare time founded the field of speech pathology. Dr. Travis did, so he's a remarkable person to be around.
So, just for our listeners, think about this: 100 years. It's been just right coming at 100 years that we measured brainwaves, and wow, have we learned a lot about since then. So, you want to give a basic primer of brainwaves and why they're important?
Absolutely, absolutely. Uh, Let me start by just picking up on what you said about how much this has changed. We measured brainwaves and, back in the 20s, there was a good bit of, I would say moderate, kind of in rising interest over those decades. When we got to the 60s and 70s, there was, again, this community of academics and clinicians in Southern California and elsewhere who really began to understand this principle of feedback, which is to say that there are systems in our body that we might think we don't have conscious control over, but what's missing is a feedback loop. So for instance, this is my neuromuscular system. I have pretty good control over that. If I was a 3-month-old, I wouldn't know what these pink wiggling things are, right? But I learn that if I do a certain thing with my brain, I can get this to move, right? That's because of feedback. And then if I'm maybe, 6 or 8 or something and I go get piano lessons, I can get very precise with these movements because there's a feedback loop. However, if I asked you, raise the temperature in your left index finger, you would just look at me like, how do you do that?" Well, it turns out if you have feedback as to whether that is rising or lowering, you can actually gain control over somatic symptoms or somatic systems that you wouldn't be able to control. The brain is very similar. The brain's an electric organ, and now I'll answer your question about brain waves and so forth. The brain's an electrical organ, which means that it operates on frequency and amplitude, just like music. On a guitar, if you pluck that G string, that's frequency. C, that's a different frequency. Amplitude, how loud are you strumming, right? Brain's at a very simple level. The brain's operating in the same way. So we have these brainwave categories, these frequency ranges. some of your listeners may be aware of, there's delta and theta and beta and in these various frequencies that dominate different parts of the brain. So you get different frequencies in different parts of the brain that dominate, and different amplitudes, the volume, so to speak, at which they're playing. So, when I was first learning about this stuff, there are some things we knew because there had been, 60 or 70 years of basic work in brain functionality. But we got to the 1990s, and there was something called the decade of the brain. Do you remember that, Bob?
I do. And actually, Dr. David Perlmutter, when he wrote brainrecovery.com, he said this next century would be the century of brain dysfunction, or at least the next decade, right? So, yeah, but let's go back to the decade of the brain, the 1990s.
Yeah, so the 1990s, somewhere in north of $1 billion was put into research on brain functionality. And the way this works with academia, I spent a good bit of time in academia, so I know how slow this can work. You spend 10 years doing that research. There's 5 years of it getting disseminated so that clinicians and other people, can actually begin to understand it. Another 5 years beginning to apply it. So we're at about that point, about 15, 20 years after that decade, or where that would take us to about 2015. And you began to have just this revolution in what we know about brain functionality. There's some very basic, broad level things that we knew back in, the 1980s when I was learning all of this. The level of specificity and granularity that we have for instance, the particular pattern of brainwave activity that's associated with depression or anxiety or trauma or performance, like the ability to, if you're an athlete, to have wide focus on the field, wide field awareness, but also to know exactly where the ball is. We know quite a bit about what particular brainwave functionality is associated with each of those things. So I was saying to you earlier, I was kind of on a happy glide path to retirement. And then this revolution occurred in the late 20-teens, around 2017, 2018. And suddenly there was a wealth of knowledge that we didn't have before, and there were devices that were a tenth the cost and a tenth the level of complexity as what I had had to learn on. So I said to myself, I cannot retire. This is way too fun. This is something I've waited for decades for. And sure enough, we're in this era now where healthcare professionals in general, mental health professionals in particular, are starting to acquire these skills in neurotherapy and incorporating them into what they do. So that they're still doing therapy, or, if they're chiropractors, they're doing their chiropractic practice, but they're able to enhance what they're already doing with these tools.
So I want to go back to the 90s for a moment. So Daniel Amen, I don't know how many books he's written at this point, but he said, hey, psychiatrists were the only medical professional that actually didn't evaluate, right, the organ that they were treating. And so they started doing these very sophisticated brain scans. But,
Yes.
I think the blood flow, that probably is less of an indicator than the brain waves themselves. But I'd like your expertise on that. What's your take on that?
Yeah, they kind of answer different questions. So the blood flow, and there's some really interesting things going on in terms of kinds of training that affect blood flow in the brain. But I would say that it's more of a global effect. You can see certain patterns in terms of blood flow and changes in blood flow of the brain under different conditions. It's kind of the term I use is smeary. The data is kind of smeary because it's broad. Neurofeedback EEG technology is more like a laser. You will know precisely what's happening within a centimeter or two in terms of the cortex of the brain and the underlying circuitry, so to speak, that allows us to be pretty targeted. I tend not to think of it as one's better than another, but it's kind of they have different purposes.
All right. So I want to go to brainwaves for a moment. And, if we can measure them, they certainly, their existence, can we affect them appreciably from the outside in? And I'm thinking about nefarious reasons, because you'll see these things about this crazy system called MK Ultra or something like that, where they're trying to hijack minds with frequencies. You want to shed a little light on that? I mean, are they legitimately doing that? How doable is that? And what do we need to do to protect people?
Boy, that's a whole podcast in itself. Let me give you kind of an initial cut on that. Uh, the brain, I tend to think of this in terms of kind of the brain evolved for certain purposes, right? And the core purpose that we're designed for, the core purpose that evolution has shaped us for is to survive, right? So that means the brain has to be responsive and receptive to environmental conditions, right? It's looking at what's happening within the body, what's happening outside of the body, and it's trying to optimize the chance for survival. One of the interesting things about the brain, being an electrical organ, is it operates on the same principle as kind of physics principles that, let's say, a musical instrument does. So if you have a guitar, I'm going to come back to this guitar metaphor probably a few times. If you have a guitar and a tuning fork and you bang the tuning fork, and let's say that resonates at A, your A string is going to vibrate, right? We call that entrainment in the brain because that happens in music, but it also happens in the brain that if you have external stimuli, it can actually, if it's resonating at a frequency that the brain is responsive to, you can actually get some you can actually get a response. We use entrainment as a technique, for instance, with sleep. We use it for a number of things, but you can use an audio file that will sound like white noise to an individual, but inside of that are delta and theta frequency. You need delta and theta to fall asleep. And so, with that sound around you, it will tend to promote an increase in delta and theta over time, and it'll help you with sleep. So that would be an example of entrainment used for good. It can also create issues potentially, and unfortunately, we live in a world where people may want to exploit that, and I do think we have to be cautious about that.
Well, I'm half thinking Vegas, when it used to be popular, they'd probably keep people awake, not just with pure oxygen, but who knows if they were pumping frequencies. That would be really
I
quite
would not be
interesting.
at all surprised. That's right.
All right. So now let's say you've got a patient that, comes in and for whatever reason, traditional psychiatry might not be working for them. So where do we apply neurofeedback, neurotherapy?
You bet. Well, let me return to the analogy of the guitar. Let's say you have the world's best guitar. Okay. If it's out of tune, it's not going to play well. I'm in Seattle, so I'll say you might be Jimi Hendrix and be able to fake it, kind of figure that out. But
He
most of
probably
us,
could. Yeah.
he probably could, but it's not going to play well. I see neurotherapy's role as tuning the guitar. It's basically giving you all the capacity that your brain was designed to give you. We can lose that capacity through stress, through a variety of factors can create dysregulation. Neurotherapy is about tuning the guitar. Once it's tuned, then you have to decide what you're going to play on that guitar, right? And that's kind of the work of psychotherapy or self-help or any of those kinds of things. So I find often patients come to me they have been down the psychiatric route in terms of medication, and maybe it just really hasn't worked for them. That's more of a chemical approach to changing the brain. Um, Sidebar on that, since you mentioned it, the thing about chemicals that are neuroactive is you're when you ingest, let's say, an SSRI for depression, that's going to basically lower your brain into a chemical bath, right? It's going to get that particular substance throughout the brain. And if it's working well, it's gonna hit the part of the brain that needed that SSRI effect, it needed that, but it's also gonna hit other areas where it might actually give you side effects. That's why we get side effects, because it's this kind of global, diffuse kind of thing. And we kind of roll the dice a little bit, in medication to see if something works or not, or if the side effects are more than you really wanna handle. So I have lots of people who come in, the medication has not worked or the side effects have really not been effective. Many people who've come to me because they've been in psychotherapy and they've gotten stuck. And very often, the first thing I'll suggest to them if they've come to me for neurofeedback, I will say I don't assume right off the bat that you need neurofeedback. I don't kn I'm a data guy. I will know if I can see the data. So the very first thing I'll do is run an EEG scan, right? A brain scan to get a look at the functionality of that individual's brain. The system that I use when we have the equipment set up, it takes about 5 minutes actually to run a good EEG. From that, I can get an idea, again, based on all that mountain of evidence from the decade of the brain, of what particular brain functionality might be underlying their problem in living. Or I have people who are coming in because they don't have a clinical issue. They're not depressed or anxious. They want to raise their game. They want to be better at decision making or at their sport that they're in or something like that. I can do the same thing with the EEG. We have some ideas of what evidence-based ideas of what patterns in the brain are associated with optimal function, not just the absence of a symptom, but the presence of peak capacity. So that's generally we'll start with data. This is a very data-driven enterprise.
My brain went in a lot of different directions. You start neurochemistry, and pharmaceuticals love neurochemistry, right? But we know it's really lacking. Stephen Kotler, he wrote a book called The Rise of Superman, and they talked about the neurochemistry of flow.
Yes.
Have we looked at the brain waves of flow? And I'm imagining different sections of the brain are going to have different wave activity. Can you shed a little light on that?
You bet. You bet. That's a really great question. First of all, you do want to screen for conditions that might be impeding not only flow, but just ordinary function, right? Somebody who's been through trauma, for instance, there's going to be a lot of there's a little structure back here in the back called the amygdala that has a lot to do with emotional processing and regulation. It often is very dysregulated in cases of trauma, for instance. So you obviously you need to address that kind of thing first. However, in somebody who's not really experiencing, let's say, clinical grade issues, somebody like that, there are particular patterns that we see that are associated with optimal flow. In the front of the brain, this is where we do our thinking, right? This is the most recently evolved part of the brain. And there is the front right. I'm going to make a generalization here, okay? Because all these parts are always interacting. But when it comes to flow state, you want to have a right side that has a good balance of slow versus fast waves. Think of slow waves allow kind of a certain calm and an openness to divergent solutions, like being creative. You want to have that right kind of mix here on the right. People who, for instance, don't have too much slow wave on the right, they're falling asleep, right? That theta is a slow, it's like brain fog. They'll come in experiencing brain fog. If you have too little theta, sometimes what that feels like is just a loss of creativity. Writer's block, for instance, comes from often, can be other things as well, but often a deficiency of theta on the right side. The left side, more about convergent thinking, coming to conclusion, making decisions, taking all of those alternative kind of creative thoughts that you've had on the right side and generating a solution and sticking with it. So depending on the kind of thing that somebody is struggling with in trying to achieve flow state, maybe they're struggling on the creative side. There are some things we would look for, again, generally speaking, on the right side of the brain. If it's more about coming to conclusion, making decisions, then we look more on the left side.
Now, if you want the right to have more theta, right part of the prefrontal cortex, I'm assuming you're talking about there.
Yes, yes.
So what's your favorite neurofeedback to do that? Is there an external aid that could possibly drive theta from
Oh,
the
what a
outside
great
in?
You bet. So, I think we might have mentioned earlier, as all this revolution occurred, in the technology, I realized that clinicians didn't really know how to use this equipment, and there's so much we knew from 30, 40 years ago that had been sort of lost. So I developed a method that is really just a compilation of what we know from the research and clinical literature over the last 30 years. I developed a method for clinicians that at its base is 13 core protocols, 13 basic specific protocols that you can customize depending on what you see in the brain. And now to directly answer your question, if you want to get more to that sweet spot with theta, right? You don't want too much. You want kind of that Goldilocks, kind of amount of theta. You would use in our method something called right frontal stabilization. And that's designed to drive up theta if we're deficient, drive down something called high beta, which we associate with distractibility. You can see how that would impede creativity. And that sometimes often there's one other frequency we'll kind of address, but it depends on the person's EEG. But that right frontal stabilization is directly what I would go to, Bob, to answer, to kind of address that. Yeah.
It's amazing that, what we're learning, what we're finding, how we can intervene at the right area at the right time. I mean, that's beyond amazing. Quick commercial break. BetterCoffeeShop.com, the home of the world's cleanest, best organic coffee, won the award 2 years in a row. Most coffee has herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, molds, mycotoxins, metals. And by the way, it doesn't have reishi. We don't have the bad, we have the good. BetterCoffeeShop.com gets your box today. So, great researcher out there, Joe Dispenza. I noticed you do things with heart rate variability. He's been measuring brain EEGs and talking about different things like brain and heart coherence. Have you looked into that, and share your thoughts if you have?
Oh, sure. Heart rate variability,
Well, not
specifically?
not just that, but the way he's talking about actually really making a connection between the brain and the heart, which I think science needs to catch up with, but that might be our ultimate goal as humans.
It's interesting because in the West, we tend to think there's this difference between the brain and the rest of the body. Well, it turns out the brain's part of the body. Who knew?
Yeah.
Right? And we have this nerve, the vagus nerve, that basically is connecting the brain and kind of carrying the conversation between the brain and the body. Heart rate is intimately tied to brain function and vice versa. Digestive function, I'm sure you're aware of that, is there are actually cells in the digestive tract that are essentially neurons. So it starts to blur the idea of what's the brain and what's the body. So we do quite a bit of work, not just with neurofeedback, but with heart rate variability, with temperature biofeedback, other methods that are addressing all of these systems and trying to get them to work together. So a very common thing that I will do is I'll train people with neurofeedback. We'll give them the protocols that are matched up to what they're dealing with. And concurrent with that, I will give them heart rate variability training, which is basically a method that's aimed at regulate. It really is about improving the conversation that the brain and the body are having. It's improving vagal tone, if you will. And that's a very robust area of research and practice in this field.
It's finally getting its due. I mean, most of us are in sympathetic overdrive. If we could just find a way to make that vagus nerve a little bit happier. So let's talk about different brain issues. So we've got this autism pandemic going out there where certain sections of the brain are hypoconnected, others hyperconnected. Have you found neurotherapy to be valuable in that demographic?
Yes, yes. I work quite a bit with individuals on the spectrum, and the idea here is not to, there are things about the experience of being on this spectrum that are valuable, that are part of that person's life experience that you wouldn't want to disturb, right? But we have clients, coming in, they're maybe wanting to get a little bit better sense of, let's say, social cues, the ability to pick up social cues, depending on what their goal is. We're kind of looking at their goal and how does that overlap with what we see in the brain, and then we target that. So there are protocols that we will use for spectrum conditions. Again, it depends on what they're dealing with as to what we would address. Spectrum conditions and certain other more pervasive conditions, that are really looking at a kind of an overall broad effect in the brain can take a little longer than a lot of neurofeedback. An uncomplicated neurofeedback protocol, and there are plenty of exceptions, but uncomplicated protocols, we're generally looking at about a 3-month period for an individual to move towards not just temporary change, but neuroplastic change. That's really the driver of neurofeedback and neurotherapy is we're creating a neuroplastic change in the brain over time, literally rewiring those circuits.
Now, we certainly know it can rewire throughout lifetime, but I'm imagining the earlier the better, right? So, how old, what is a reasonable age? Let's say family's dealing with an autistic child. What's the earliest that you think would be reasonable to start?
The short answer to that is will their head fit the cap?
Okay.
That's kind of one thing we have to consider, of course, just the practicality of it. Uh, the brain, the brain functionality is different at younger ages, and so you definitely need a neurotherapist who understands, how the brain is functioning differently, so we're not trying to train them to an adult standard, but to something that's of their age. I generally work with, kids that are 8 and up. Most clinicians that are in outpatient practice will do that level of work. I am aware of neurotherapists, however, who, are doing work with kids that are younger, than that.
And what's the frequency? You're talking 3 months, 90 days. Is that 3 times a week, an hour session? What are we looking at?
Well, I'd say again, with the uncomplicated case, you've got somebody with basic anxiety or depression or something like that. We're generally talking, like I said, about 3 months. The way I think about this is it's kinda like going to the gym. It turns out that you can buy a gym membership, but if you don't show up, you're not gonna get
Yeah.
six-pack abs, right? Same thing with this. This is, by the way, training, not treatment. It's not like you take a pill and you can read a book or whatever, and if the pill happens to match your metabolism, it's gonna have an effect. On the other hand, when you pill wears off, you're back to where you were. This requires kind of an engagement, with the training, and it's cumulative, so just like the gym. So the more you do it, the quicker you'll have an effect and the more lasting that effect will be. So to answer your question just directly, uncomplicated case, usually about 3 months. Generally, you wanna aim for 5 times a week at least. If you can do
Well,
it daily, so much the better.
and how long are the sessions?
Training generally kids will generally do a little shorter, but the training for adults is generally, around 20 minutes, in our method. If it's somebody very experienced with neurofeedback, it might be a little longer, and you'll have an effect sooner.
Are they supervised sessions? I could see if someone's not quite doing it right, you're gonna get neuroplastic changes that you didn't want.
That's right. So this is a great question, and this is part of the revolution in neurotherapy is up until about 2017, you had to go into an office, to do the training, and maybe, most people, if they can get there twice a week, they're lucky. Uh, well, imagine going to the gym twice a week. It's gonna be a long time before you get six-pack abs, right? So,
Yep.
the dose effect has always been a challenge in neurotherapy is to get to the appropriate dose. So, the rise of this new equipment has allowed us to do remote training, at-home training. Now, that doesn't mean the neurotherapist isn't involved, but it means the dose effect can go way up. They can do training every day, if they want. We generally, the way we do this, it's always a trade-off. You would kind of like to have them in the office every single day, but let me put it this way, if they're having a sleep dysregulation, the therapist probably doesn't wanna be with them at 11 o'clock at night, while they're doing a sleeping
Yeah.
protocol. Yeah. So with remote training, an experienced neurotherapist is gonna work with that client, basically train them on how to set the cap up, which with this new equipment is actually very simple. It's very simple. I've not had a client who was not able to really set that up, either if it's a child and the parent is doing that. And, so, this would be, a scenario where that you train them, you make sure that they're doing this properly, and then let them loose, and, they have an opportunity to train. We check in. I can monitor their progress in vivo, live, in real time if I want to, or just check in at the end of the day and see how their training, was. I generally meet with them for a certain amount of time, every week, possibly biweekly once they've really mastered it, mostly in order to manage the protocol. Because as the brain improves, you need to kind of adjust the protocol. It's not a fire and forget kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So It is a concern to me when if you have somebody, a professional who just sets somebody up and says, "I'll see you in 3 months."
Yeah.
That would not be ethical practice. But, finding that sweet spot where you have that remote capability, but you're monitoring, and available for coaching, that's really what we aim for.
Well, that's exciting progression. One of my mentors said years ago, if you want to change your mind, you literally do need to change your mind. And that's what you're doing, right? You're getting people to wire and in a very sophisticated way. Hey, these areas are not creating the right brain waves at the right amplitude at the right time. That's why you're anxious. That's why you're depressed. That's why you can't focus, on and on and on. And 90 days, what kind of dollar investment are people tending to look at for a 90-day protocol with neurofeedback?
Yeah, it depends on the device that we use. There are times we can use a single channel device that's a little less expensive. Depends on a lot of things in terms of the way things are, people are set up. I would say in general, it's about let's call it $2,500 for a 3-month period of training, and that would include the EEG and the device and the coaching.
Well, it'd be hard to imagine a better investment because I think we all know that what goes on between our ears might be the most important thing. That and, within our heart itself, right? But why separate the two? The brain and the heart are absolutely connected. Doc, for my audience, we tend to go right at about 30 minutes. We cross that magic number. One, where do people get a hold of you, and what lasting message do you want to leave with this podcast?
Sure. Well, in terms of reaching me, I'm a good place to connect with me would be at True Bearing Academy, truebearingacademy.com. That's our training site. And if you're a clinician, that'd be a great place to connect. If you're a civilian, you'll find some things on that website that I think will be useful to you. If you want to reach me directly, Nathan at True Bearing Consulting would be the best way to reach me. And I would just say, just to echo what you were saying a moment ago, Dr. Bob, the message I would like to leave people with is if you feel that you're just stuck, that you've been trying lots of different things, you've tried medication, you've tried psychotherapy, you've tried self-help, none of that is really quite tuning your guitar. Consider that there is a way of doing that directly, and that we can either help directly or we can find there are neurotherapists around the world that I'm involved with right now that can assist you with that.
Well, what a beautiful service at a beautiful price. I'm thinking we're going to need to have a follow up to this. And by the way, I'm going to encourage everybody reach out if you're struggling for sure. But guess what? If you want the best of the best, I got plenty of patients that want that. Imagine 90 days, $2,500, a brain that works better. I couldn't imagine a better use of time or resources. And I want to thank you for sharing for, 45 years at this point, 4.5 decades of finding really good ways to create a healthier brain. I got to tell you, I taught a brains, seminar series, and it was so disappointing at how weak the advancements were. These are true advancements. The whole world can get better, and I'm honored to have this time with you, and excited to share the world and make the world better with you.
I'm delighted to be with you, Dr. Bob. I hope we get to continue the conversation.
I trust that we will. And as always, I'm Dr. Bob Rakowski, absolutely knowing that we can all be happy, healthy, and successful.